In 1937, the Japanese Empire embarked on a campaign to destroy the nationalist government of China. However, as the years dragged on, hundreds of thousands of Japanese troops would be bogged down in a stalemate. Hoping to obtain a new empire, Japan was faced with two options: expand north from the homelands, or strike south, seizing the resource-rich possessions of the Western colonies. A 4-year campaign of propaganda, education, and legislation had prepared the Japanese people for a high-stakes showdown. It would come as a series of stunning offensives, from Malaya to Pearl Harbor. December 13, 1937, is recognized as the date when Japanese troops began to ravage the city of Nanjing. 24 hours earlier, the USS Panay, an American gunboat stationed on the Yangtze, was attacked and sunk by Japanese aircraft during the battle for Shanghai. Despite showing 3 American flags, diplomacy, apologies, and cash compensation settled the matter.
The Japanese government and people wish to express sincerest and profoundest regrets.
But nothing could reverse the tide of global public opinion, as Japan's empire became increasingly mistrusted and increasingly isolated. In August 1937, the cabinet of Prime Minister Konoe Fumimaro issued the guidelines for the execution of the National Spiritual Mobilization, the first steps towards galvanizing the nation for war.
Everyone was encouraged to support the state and to see men off to war, to provide labor for various work projects.
Those goods that are being sold are tied into products that have a linkage with imperial expansion. So we'll see comfort bags. These are bags that would have various items, perhaps chocolate, maybe caramel, letters from children, small gift items that imperial subjects, individuals can purchase and then have sent to the front.
People also were encouraged not to be extravagant, not to waste, and to remember that the country was at war. And so one of the banners that was flown in many cities read, "Extravagance is the enemy."
By 1936, the Imperial Military Reserve Association, comprising members who had completed their required national service, numbered 3 million. The majority recruited from the countryside. Within a year, 500,000 of them were back in uniform and sent to China. Nagatani Masao, a typical recruit, was seen off by his father. He wrote, "I promised that I would become a splendid man."
So what becomes the experience of imperial development for a young boy is that as the education system shifts from the 1920s to the 1930s, as the Japanese military becomes really much more kind of militaristic or jingoistic, nationalistic in its push, young individuals in Japan see their future as a military soldier.
Hideki Kurobayashi's story is not unusual. Born in Ozuzugawa village, his education was militaristic and his opinions black and white. It was our mission to go and fight China, he recalled. Japan had to control China. That's what my father said, so that's where I went. In my village, I was called a patriotic child.
Every extended family was affected in some way and sent at least one or more boys or men from the family off to fight. And of course, all Japanese were, at the outset, were patriotic, and this seemed like the right thing to do.
Textbooks and propaganda pamphlets issued by the Ministry of Education pictured children as shokukumen, productive little nationals. Hatano Kanji, a child psychologist, recruited to serve on a national education planning committee, said, "I would like to see a culture that makes children positively participate and work, not one that treats children as precious." Propaganda focused on service to the nation, including kamishibai, a form of picture storytelling.
Kamishibai are paper plays, and they are the most popular form of children's entertainment. What you have is a box on the back, usually of a bicycle, and it's oftentimes a slightly elderly guy, and he pulls the images out of the box, and then he narrates the story, pulls the next slide, and the children can be involved in that. Initial Kamishibai children's production, which was mostly about crazy characters, they start to have more militaristic themes.
From 1934, roughly 750,000 children per day watched kamishibai in Tokyo alone. The heroes of the stories were soldiers, who almost always died valiantly. But the audience for kamishibai was declining, for a reason that caused official concern. In the interwar years, the birth rate in almost every developed nation fell amidst economic hardship and increasing international tension. Japan was no exception. The live birth rate dropped from 13 per thousand before 1937 to less than 10 per thousand. Encouraging large families, the government lent couples wedding clothes if they were too poor to afford a ceremony. Families with 10 children or more were promised free higher education. Tojo Katsuko, wife of a government minister and mother of 7 children, announced cheerfully that having babies is fun. At school, children received the Ministry of Education's 1937 Cardinal Principles of the National Polity.
Japanese people were told at school from a young age that their role as Japanese citizens was to respect the emperor and devote themselves to the nation.
So the emperor was the supreme benefactor of the entire country. And so in theory, all Japanese felt grateful to the emperor for everything he did for them, felt obligated to repay him in some way.
They rehearsed this idea on a daily basis by reciting the Imperial rescript on education and bowing to the portrait of the emperor.
As trams passed the Imperial Palace or Yasukuni Shrine, the conductor would say, "Please bow," and passengers would reverently comply.
Beginning in November 1937, the Japanese government created what might be called moments of reverential silence. And what this orchestrated, choreographed moment required was that all Japanese and Japanese subjects face the Imperial Palace in Tokyo and observe a minute of silence.
On January 16, 1938, a radio broadcast announced that Japan no longer recognized Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang government in China. Prime Minister Konoe would later call the announcement an utter blunder. The error was not recognizing that Chiang was still the most powerful and ruthless figure in China. The alliance between the Chinese Red Army and the Kuomintang was in name only, the former providing little support to battle the Japanese. While the Communist Party built its strength in the countryside, Chiang Kai-shek concentrated his efforts on defending the cities and strategic infrastructure. To disrupt the Japanese advance, in June 1938, Chiang Kai-shek ordered the dike holding the Yellow River at Huaiyuankou to be breached. No warning was given. It would have alerted the Japanese to the plan. "3,000 square kilometers of Chiang's own country flooded, at the cost of perhaps 800,000 Chinese lives. Crops were destroyed, and the silt deposited across farms rendered the land untenable for years to come. The Japanese were beyond the range of the flood, and the waters only briefly impeded their advance. By December 1938, Japan held all of China that was necessary to control trade and communication, all of the major coastal cities and railways. Chiang Kai-shek had moved his nationalist government to Changqing. On December 22nd, Prime Minister Konoe said, "The Japanese government is resolved to carry on the military operations for the complete extermination of the anti-Japanese Kuomintang government, and at the same time, to proceed with the work of establishing a new order in East Asia." By the time of Pearl Harbor, more than 1 million Japanese military personnel were serving overseas. The 1930s Japan was perhaps the world's most homogeneous major nation. Less than 1% of its population were not descended from those who had crossed from mainland Asia millennia earlier. Despite this, it was not a society without dissent.
If you were overheard saying things that sounded defeatist, the secret police would visit you and call you in for an interrogation. And children and teenagers and military recruits were all required to keep diaries. And the diaries were submitted to their superiors every 7 to 10 days for what were called diary checks.
Rumors, gossip, and spying all fed police intelligence about dissident activity, published annually in a volume called The State of Social Movements. A schoolteacher was heard to say, "We are fighting in China because the military are out of control." In another, a farmer was quoted, "If the emperor would just say the word, the war would stop." With the rise of militarism, the heavy-handed suppression of domestic dissent sometimes included torture and imprisonment without trial. Voices of doubt were not confined to the home front. A soldier, Motojima Saburo, wrote home, "It has been raining every day, and I have been lonely most of the time." But the national sentiment was more truthfully represented by a soldier who wrote, "The Hinamaru flag was raised high. We were 100 meters from the enemy when we shouted, 'Banzai!' I was moved beyond control." Tokyo's hopes for a resolution of what it persisted in calling the China Incident rested on the economic disintegration of Chiang Kai-shek's government. The flight of 12 million refugees from Japanese atrocities, notably in Nanjing, was the largest movement of people in history and compounded Chiang's problems. Shanghai contributed 85% of the country's revenue before it fell to the Japanese. China was dependent on foreign loans, which Japan wanted to cut off.
日中戦争がなかなか終わらないわけですね。どうしてなのかっていうと、これは中国をイギリスが支援している。そしてそのイギリスをさらにアメリカが支援している。こういう構造があるわけですね。だからなかなか日本がいくら戦っても日中戦争が終わらない。だから日本の中ではイギリスやアメリカを抑えなきゃダメだっていうこういう考え方が強くなってきます。
Alarmed by increasing hostilities from Japan, the United States announced that it would not renew the 1911 Treaty of Commerce and Navigation with Japan. This proved to be the catalyst that pivoted the empire's plan of expansion. From an initial strategy of striking north, occupying and suppressing territory in China and Mongolia, it turned to a plan of striking south.
陸軍は中国大陸で行動を起こすということをいつも考えています。それから海軍は太平洋方面で行動を起こすことを考えていますから全く違うわけですね。で、この太平洋戦争を起こす際にもですね、陸軍はやはり、満州あるいは東南アジアの行動を主に考えてますだけど。
The Japanese army needed to demonstrate that victory would come on land. The Navy wanted to win at sea. But advancing north placed the Japanese army face to face with a dangerous opponent.
The Soviet Far East and the Japanese Empire in Northeast China kind of overlaid each other. Stalin began to build up military forces along the Manchurian-Siberian border.
In May 1939, a dispute flared up near the village of Nomonhan between Soviet troops stationed in their client state of Mongolia and Japanese troops who had moved across the border from Manchukuo. Within days, both sides built up their forces, with nearly 60,000 Soviets facing almost 40,000 troops of the Guangdong Army. Throughout June, the clash escalated into a modern, mechanized offensive.
This time, the Soviet Union is in a big turmoil. Stalin is essentially purging his officer corps in the Army and the Navy. And so Japan is thinking the Soviets are sort of easy pickings.
As both sides added to their strength on the ground, battles raged in the skies, with the latest aircraft meeting in continuous dogfights. By July 6th, Japan had secured its only successes. In the next stage, they were thrown back over the Khalkha River. The Soviet Union's counterattack opened on August 20th with a massed artillery barrage.
They used tanks, armored cars, heavy artillery concentrations, and air power, and give the Japanese a preview of what it might be like to fight the Soviet Union.
The Japanese had anticipated a battle of attrition. The Soviets, with more than 500 armored vehicles at their disposal, launched a campaign of movement. 11 days later, the Japanese Manchukuo army were almost completely wiped out.
And this becomes the first time that they look at the Soviet army with some kind of respect. Now, the local commanders, they're all ready to start again. But this is one of those moments where the high command in Tokyo said, enough. We're already bogged down in China. We cannot afford to expand into a major front with a war against the Soviet Union.
On September 1st, Germany's invasion of Poland opened the European war, transforming diplomacy. Japan began negotiations in Moscow, reaching a truce on the 16th. With quiet on the northern Soviet front, Japan had more flexibility to move in the south. "120,000 Japanese troops began to move deeper into China, descending on the National Army at Changsha on September 14th. The Japanese were rebuffed at first, but on the 19th of September, renewed their attack, this time with airstrikes and poison gas. By October 6th, well-managed Kuomintang counterattacks had so bloodied the Japanese army that they were forced to withdraw. In February 1940, the last public criticism of the army was heard in the Diet. If we miss a chance for peace, the politicians of today will be unable to erase their crime, even by their deaths. The speaker was forced to resign, and within 6 months, all political parties were banned.
There was a clear leadership in the person of the emperor. There was a coherent narrative in which Japan had been in danger for decades and had to fight for its survival. And there was a grand plan, the 8 corners of the world under the one roof, and eventual victory.
On August 1st, Foreign Minister Yusuke Matsuoka formally announced the plan to create a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. The idea had been part of Japan's political conversation for some time. An idea that evolved from an ideal. Liberating Asia from white colonial overlords and transforming East Asian territories into satellites of Japan's empire.
何百何千というようにですね、狭い地域を支配するという、そういうその計画まで立ってましたけれども、じゃあこれだけの広大な土地をどういう政体制で、支配していくかということはまだ全然議論してない。それからどういうスケジュールでこれを作っていくかということも全くできてないんですね。ただとにかく大きな日本が占領した地域をこういう形にした方がいいという夢があるだけで。
The catch cry for the ideal was Asia for the Asiatics. The reality was made explicit in March 1941, when the Imperial Rule Assistance Association explicitly stated, although we use the expression Asian cooperation, this by no means ignores the fact that Japan was created by the gods or posits an automatic racial equality.
1940年にドイツがフランス、オランダを降伏させると、オランダ、フランスがアジアに持っていた植民地が空いてしまいました。そこをドイツに取られるかもしれないと考えた日本は、ドイツと同盟を結ぶことによって東南アジアへの進出を図りました。
Britain, standing alone against Germany, seemed on the brink of defeat. For Japan, there was wisdom in an alliance with the Reich and its Italian ally.
結局、当時の日本っていうのはですね、やっぱりドイツがヨーロッパで、フランスを降伏させたっていう、これを非常に衝撃的に捉えていて、やっぱりドイツの力を非常に高く見積もったんですね。ですからドイツに付き従って、国家戦略をですね組み直していくわけです。ですから
The tripartite pact bound Germany, Italy, and Japan to assist each other by all political, economic, and military means. Whether Japan would receive the assistance she would need was another matter. Heavily dependent on imported supplies, Japan was hit hard as the war restricted access to the country. And in 1940, the government began to control food distribution.
It's determined that each person should get so much rice, so much fish, so many vegetables, and the portions are not generous. And so the daily per capita fish ration in 1941 is 1.8 ounces of fish. Pretty small piece of fish.
Rationing had been a fixture of life in Japan since 1938, when the government launched 2 austerity campaigns. Imposed austerity controlled petroleum, coal, telephones, and leather goods. Voluntary austerity was a hearts and minds campaign, compulsion as a matter of conscience. Flashy fashions were condemned, and men were urged to wear the national civilian uniform. Women were discouraged from wearing cosmetics, and hairdressers were permitted to give each customer only 3 curls. In August 1940, the government fixed the prices of 40 vegetables and fruits, which had risen by 400% in the previous year. Aoto Minso, the wife of a farmer, declared, "They demand more work, and we have to do it. There are higher taxes. Farmers can't take it anymore." Most daily basics were strictly controlled, but a black market flourished. City dwellers defied regulations, traveling to the countryside in their thousands to buy direct from farmers. In the face of growing doubts, a newspaper told its readers, "Peace and contentment can only be gained by eradicating the evil encroachment of the Anglo-Saxons." On April 13th, the Soviet Union signed a neutrality agreement with Japan that recognized the puppet state of Manchukuo. In a broadcast on June 29th, the foreign minister advocated the inclusion of certain South Sea areas in the new order in East Asia. It was the first public expression of the policy of expanding to the south and building a defensive perimeter.
ですからその戦争になった時に日本の弱点は資源がないということですから、先手を打って、南の方に進んで石油などの資源をあらかじめ確保しようとするんですね。
On the 17th of July 1940, just as France fell, the British government yielded to Japanese pressure and closed the Burma Road, a vital artery supplying the Chinese. With her focus elsewhere, Britain was unable to counter militarily.
The problem for Japan is the flow of war material into China. It's flowing in through Hong Kong and southern Chinese ports such as Guangdong, and it's also flowing through the Burma Road, which goes through Burma. This war material is absolutely keeping Chiang Kai-shek's military afloat.
In appeasing the Japanese, Churchill failed to prevent dangerous developments. On July 22, 1940, the military party in Japan triumphed. General Hideki Tojo, the future prime minister, became Minister for War.
東條という人はですね、当時の陸軍を非常にうまくコントロールしていました。ですから戦争にもしなったとすれば 東条を中心に陸軍は団結するでしょうし、もし戦争ではないと、戦争はダメだっていうことになったとしても、東条だったら陸軍を抑えて、その陸軍がですね、その暴発することを避けることができるんじゃない。
A request that the Vichy government of France permit the stationing of Japanese troops in northern Indochina was the first practical expression of the Strike South policy. The tripartite Treaty of Alliance allowed the Japanese government to negotiate directly with the Vichy regime.
Japan goes to France and says, you know, we want to cut off the material coming through northern Indochina, North Vietnam, and so they get the French to agree in 1941 to allow the Japanese to occupy northern Indochina.
Later, the Vichy government was informed that the Japanese army would push further into Indochina on July 24, 1941, irrespective of the Vichy government's position. They acquiesced to the peaceful entry of Japanese troops.
そうすると8月1日にアメリカが日本に対する石油を全面禁輸したわけですね。で、そうしますと当時日本の石油の備蓄っていうのは約1年半ぐらいだったんです。
America begins to tighten the noose and gradually escalates different kinds of economic sanctions. It was a spectacular failure of deterrence diplomacy because instead of deterring aggression, it did the exact opposite. It accelerated it.
On September 22, 1941, columns from the Imperial Japanese Army moved over the border in 3 places and advanced on the railhead near Longzhou. On the morning of the 24th, Japanese aircraft, in breach of the agreement with Vichy, attacked French positions on the coast. By the evening of the 26th, fighting had died down. Japan was allowed, amongst other concessions, 3 airfields, placing her aircraft within range of future targets and control of port and railway facilities that choked off a supply route into China. When the Japanese offensive to create the co-prosperity sphere was launched at the end of 1941, the air bases were critical to providing air support for the invasion of Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. Japan Strike South conquered each area, providing the empire with tin, rubber, and above all, oil. One giant question mark hung over the plan.
当時のですね、東条たちが考えた戦略というのは、まず日本は直接アメリカをノックアウトする手段がありません。ですから南方の南の資源地帯をがっちり確保して、なるべく長期戦で粘って、長期戦で頑張っていれば、いずれヨーロッパでドイツがイギリスを破る。
An Imperial conference held on September 6th prepared a report which said, although America's total defeat is judged utterly impossible, it is not inconceivable that a shift in America's public opinion due to our victories in Southeast Asia or to England's surrender might bring war to an end.
そこでアメリカがあるいはイギリスがアジアに持っていたフィリピンやマレー半島、
日本はですね、東南アジアに侵攻して、 そして日本に必要な軍事物資を獲得しようということが一つの目的、戦争開戦の目的がありました。でもう一つは、中国の蒋介石に対する援償ルートを叩くという、この目的のためにですね、戦争を、起こしたわけですが、戦争を起こすと必ずアメリカが介入してくる。それでその開戦の前にアメリカ艦隊を叩けば、アメリカは手を出せない。その間に東南アジア。
Prime Minister Konoe thought it manifestly unwise for Japan to plunge into an unpredictable war and resigned on October 16, 1941. He was replaced by the War Minister, Hideki Tojo, who said, "If we just acquiesce to the American demand, everything we have achieved in China will be lost."
東條という人はかなり独裁者のイメージがありますけれども非常に人を使うのが上手い人だったんです。東條は一度失敗した人をもう一回使ってやるんですね。東條に忠誠を誓うんですね。天皇の信頼っていうのはですね非常に高かった。彼は確かに独裁者的なところはありましたけれども、ある意味でやっぱり非常に天皇には忠実だった人物であるというふうに言えると思います。彼の力の源は総理大臣であるということにあるのではなくて陸軍大臣なんですね。当時戦争をやるについてはその国民を黙らせないといけない。で憲兵を握っているのもやっぱり陸軍なんですよね。ですからその東條英機の権力の源は陸軍大臣であるということにその権力の源があって彼はこれを最大限に利用しました。
As long as there remains the great spirit of loyalty and patriotism, we have nothing to fear in fighting America and Britain. So said Hideki Tojo. On November 1st, 1941, the Vice Chief of Staff said, "There is a strong probability that our advance to the south will enable Germany and Italy to defeat England. It will also greatly increase the probability that we can force China to surrender, and then even the Soviet Union."
Japan is already at war with the largest nation in the world in terms of population, China. She's planning for a war with the second largest nation in the world territorially, the Soviet Union. And here she goes actively at war against the largest empire in the world, the British Empire, and the largest economy in the world, the United States, to say nothing of the other major maritime power like the Netherlands.
On December 4th, the Imperial Combined Fleet was sailing for Hawaii under the command of national hero Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who had studied at Harvard University.
Admiral Yamamoto, he lived in the United States. He saw the oil fields of Texas. He saw the steel mills of Pittsburgh and Cleveland and the wheat fields of Kansas and Iowa. He knows the latent potential of the United States if it fully mobilizes for war against anybody.
をできないものかっていうふうに考えた時に当時はアメリカ艦隊がアメリカ太平洋艦隊が日本に来て日本にだんだん来航してきて日本と、艦隊決戦をやるっていうのが海軍の、基本的な戦略でしたのでこれを何とかしなきゃいけない。その時にイソロクが考えたのは日本がパーフェクトで勝つ方法は奇襲作戦を持ってすなわちアメリカ艦隊がハワイのパールハーバーにいる時にそこに奇襲攻撃をかけて全滅させれば少なくても半年や1年はアメリカはその日本および東南アジアのところに来ることができない。その間に 日本の、東南アジアにおけるすなわち大東亜共栄圏ですね、共栄圏のブロックを完全にすれば
もちろん基本的に作戦を立案するのは陸軍や海軍が立案しますけれども、最終的な許可を与えるのは天皇です。ですから天皇がOK を出さなければ命令は出せない。
An imperial rescript was issued under the emperor's name. Proclaimed on December 8th and read aloud in every town and village, it said, "We hereby declare war on the United States of America and the British Empire. The men and officers of our army and navy shall do their utmost in prosecuting the war. Our public servants of various departments shall perform faithfully and diligently their respective duties. The entire nation, with a united will, shall mobilize their total strength so that nothing will miscarry in the attainment of our war aims."
大きな影響力を持てる天皇になりたいって思いが非常に強かったんですね。だけどそのために逆にちょっとやりすぎてしまって、明治天皇からそういう軍人天皇という性格が強まって、一番その頂点にいるのが昭和天皇なんですね。ですからそういう意味では昔からの天皇の中では非常に珍しい存在であるというふうに言えますね。
However, by the time the rescript declaring war had been made public, the first battle was over. Earlier, on December 7th, Japan's striking force of 6 aircraft carriers were positioned northwest of Hawaii. Admiral Yamamoto's cable ordering the strike famously instructed, "Nitaka Yamanabore, climb Mount Nitaka, attack as planned." Mount Nitaka was then the highest peak in the empire. A pilot said, "I saw a heroic battle for the first time. To have been able to take part in this battle was for a warrior the greatest joy." The first wave of fighters and bombers struck at 0750 hours in the morning. "19 American ships were lost and damaged in the carnage, along with 300 airplanes. The deaths of military and civilian personnel exceeded 2,400. But Pearl Harbor was just one of Japan's Pacific targets. 11,000 kilometers away and 40 minutes earlier, the first Japanese landings went ashore in Malaya. 3 hours after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese attacked Hong Kong. To mount the coordinated offensive, Japan had 680,000 troops in China and 170,000 to be used elsewhere.
Probably the largest globally synchronized series of one-day attacks in the history of mankind. They are attacking targets that stretch from the Indian Ocean to Pearl Harbor.
Hideyuki Kurabayashi remembered reading about the attacks in a newspaper. He thought Japan had done a bold thing. He remembered, "Everyone thought we would probably win."
People were excited, they were really ecstatic. And the various government agencies, the Home Ministry, prefectural governments, and even local town and village governments carried out pro-war rallies beginning on December 10th.
Kenji Kitagawa was a schoolboy. He remembered hearing the news on the radio. My mother and father said how a terrible thing had happened. Because besides the people in high spirits saying we won the battle at Pearl Harbor, there were many Japanese who were concerned about going to war against such big countries. They were anxious about what would happen.
People who had some sense of American power are very upset because they don't think Japan can defeat a country as great as America.
41-year-old Sakamoto Tane, who lived in a port city on the island of Shikoku, expressed the general feeling in her diary when she wrote, "At long last, the war has started."
もう日本は、1935年ぐらいからずっと戦争をやってましてですね、もうその戦争慣れをしていて、どういう準備をしたら戦争を始められるか、それから国民に対しても今はもう戦時である、で国民はみんな緊張して国家のために尽くさなきゃならないという、そういう教育をやってきてましたので、国中がもう戦争のために動くようになってました。
The Asahi Shimbun newspaper described the scenes in Hiroshima City on December 9th. Yesterday's excitement turned today to a determination to serve in ways that could lead to certain victory. And in the cold rain that had been falling from early morning, crowds of ordinary people went to pray for certain victory at the Gukoku Shrine. The governor of Shizuoka Prefecture said, "Recognizing that the conflict will be long, each of us should pledge to overcome the 10,000 difficulties, overthrow the enemy countries, and move towards their annihilation."
And the rallies had grand names like Rally to Support the Greater East Asia War, or a rally to support the annihilation of the Americans and the British. Some of these rallies attracted as many as 70,000 people.
West of Hawaii lie a ring of fortified islands that would render Japan's co-prosperity sphere defensible. Wake and Guam were American outposts that upset the integrity of Japan's perimeter. Each were targets in Japan's mass assault on the Pacific. Guam fell at once. However, a Marine garrison held out on Wake for 2 weeks, until December 23rd. Japan had galvanized its foothold in the Pacific. But the ramifications of war were soon to be felt. On January 7th, the USS Pollock sunk a Japanese freighter off Tokyo. It was the first of 1,113 merchant ships and 201 warships American submariners were to sink in the Pacific War. Belts started to tighten on the home front. But early success fueled the military, and Admiral Otomi Ugaki declared on New Year's Day 1942, "The main thing is to win, and we surely will." The Japanese described themselves as being victory drunk. Their troops were closing in on the supposedly impregnable fortress of Singapore. And their navy was making plans to draw the Americans into a decisive encounter near an island of which nobody had heard. Midway.
PBS America discovers how monasteries shaped every aspect of medieval Britain and created a dazzling array of art, architecture and literature in Saints and Sinners, a millennium of monasteries. Next.